today we will have panel discussion, which will be conducted by our moderator is Vicario. Please give applause with Vicario, and I'd like to invite him here. He is the head of Go Academy. As you know, the Go Academy is our portal to access education. So we give education for fresh grad and a junior engineer. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. So essentially, we are a talent incubation programs because we want to help Indonesia to produce more and more high quality tech talents, right? Because as startup grows, we're gonna need like more and more technical talents. But then again, as a company, Gojek wants to be proactive, so we can help Indonesia to always become a better nation.
Okay, and if you want to join the session, you can ask Vicario on or check in our Gojek portal. We have the information in there.
Yeah.
And to make it short, I give the floor for Vicario to invite our speaker.
Okay, thank you, Yolanda. So, hi everyone, right? Welcome to Gojek, right? Is it your first time coming here? Awesome, cool. So yeah, just before I call the speakers, right? We actually opened like the questions like a few days ago, and we realized that there are not so many questions yet. But I wish that as time goes by, as our speakers talk, there will be like more and more questions from you, right? If you are brave, then you can just like raise your hands. I'll allow you to own the mic and ask the questions directly to the speakers. But if you are shy and you think that it's better for you to just type, I think you can use the same link that Yolanda provided like a few days ago, right? Okay, cool. I mean, like we really want this to be interactive, right? I will ask some questions that I prepare, but my questions is limited. You have all the questions, then so please help me to ask questions. Okay, so let's get started. I'm gonna call all the speakers. I think the first one is Diana Yao, PM at Facebook. Please give a round of applause. The second one is Charu Jangit from SPM at LinkedIn. And the last one is Amit Gamane, PM at Gojek. Okay, so welcome to Gojek. Welcome to Indonesia. Yeah, I think you should have the mic. Cool. Yes. Awesome. Cool. So I think I'll ask the opening question first, right? Can you tell us a bit about yourself and what you are working at this moment? Yeah, you can use mine.
Super excited to be here. It's our first time in Jakarta and in Indonesia, and we got to firsthand experience the traffic. So thank you for being all on the road. But I'm Diana Yao. It's great to meet you guys. I'm based in Silicon Valley, work at Facebook. I've been a product manager at Facebook for the last 2 years, and I work on our internet connectivity products. And we're working with an Indonesia partner, but basically we're responsible for setting up Wi-Fi hotspots all around in emerging markets to get the next billion people connected.
Oh, this works now. Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name's Charu Jangid. Until I guess 2 weeks ago, I worked at LinkedIn and I was a senior product manager there. I've been at LinkedIn for about 3.5 years. And then I kind of decided that I was kind of sick of helping people find jobs. And instead, I wanted to help people catch Pokemon in their neighborhood. And so I'll be working at another company called Niantic, which is a startup that made Pokemon Go. So that was a fun conversation with my parents. They totally understood my career choices. But yeah, I'm really excited to be here. We just got here today morning, and it's super exciting to be in Jakarta.
Hi everyone, I'm Amit from the fraud team here in Gojek. So I'm usually based in Singapore, but I'm in Jakarta for this week. So the fraud team basically works on tools and products to detect and prevent fraud. And I think it's always funny like that we're named the fraud team and not the anti-fraud team. And so that's a little internal.
What are you doing on that team?
That's highly confidential.
All right. Okay, so I think that from your introduction, it's pretty clear that most of you like building products that's used not only in your country of origin, but it's like used somewhere else across the globe, right? So can you tell us a bit more about how does it take to build like a global product?
A lot of traveling. We were talking about it this morning. So some of the themes. Number one, we talked about building a global team. So you have the examples of Uber, who go out to different markets and literally have what they call a launch. There's another word for it, but a launch team that comprises of local people and also are headed by some of the people from HQ. And that's really critical because one thing to build a global product, you have to understand the people. And the people that understand the locals are the ones that have been operating in those markets. So right now we have one of our Wi-Fi hotspot products going on in India. And the person responsible for it developing the product is me, but also one of our growth managers. So he's been critical to the success because when we're working with our partner, and sometimes they keep telling us yes, that they can build these feature and accommodate this, it actually means no. And the growth manager is able to assess that from just talking with the partner and be able to understand what's in the realm of possibility or not. So that's one of the key things.
Yeah, I think for at least at LinkedIn, there are a few things that the team really thought about when it was like, how do we get LinkedIn to work in all of these markets outside of the US? And so one of the thing is the most basic level, which is the app functional? So does the app work on low speed networks? Like images on the newsfeed don't load in many countries. And so the very basic thing that we're trying to solve is, can we just make this app functional at the very basic level in markets outside? The second one is kind of around use cases. And so in some markets, for example, in Japan, social networking or putting your profile on the public domain is not kind of seen as something, it's like boastful. You don't want to do that. And so how can we make sure that the LinkedIn use case that works in the US and in Western markets also applies to these other markets? And the job seeking activity, for example, is very different in different markets. And so can we make sure that this product is making sense when we're going to a new country? The third thing after, I would say, is it like functioning? Is there a use case? Is platformization? And so one example is when we initially launched in China, there was a separate app, which was built in a completely different tech stack. But what that ended up doing is it made it possible for us to really localize the product, but then it created some inefficiencies around how fast can we develop new features, because now we have to build features across like several apps. And so platformization is really key to make sure that you have one platform and then your team is just building platform features, and then those platform features can be customized for the markets, based on what works in each market.
Yeah, so I'm going to take a stab at the question because Gojek is just starting to expand, right? So I think we've covered most of the important points. So from Gojek's perspective, I think the two most important things that I've seen is the research team that has field researchers who are embedded like on the ground, like simple things like how do you even search for address to go home, right? That differs from place to place, right? For example, to my understanding in Jakarta, like there's no fixed format for address, right? It can be as short as like 1 line or like 5 lines, right? Whereas in Singapore, people use their postal code, right? So it's a very different way of searching. And if I just ported one thing over to the other without a consideration for that, you're not going to see a lot of uptake, right? So having those nuances and the insights actually matter. And then the second thing, like you said, building things as platforms, right? So in terms of engineering, so from Gojek's perspective, from I think pretty much the start when the engineering team started to build out, everything was tried to build was built as a platform or like infrastructure. So what happens is you have devs working on only one thing, but based on which market you're in, you just kind of clone or reproduce that for that market. So you abstract away the problem of having to deal with like many dev cycles, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, when you were talking about nuances, one of the things I also remembered was at LinkedIn, my product was the profile. So essentially, our main goal with the LinkedIn profile is in the first week or the first 30 days of you being on LinkedIn, can we get you to a certain level of like profile completion? Because when people complete their LinkedIn profiles, they're just much more likely to get job opportunities. People are more likely to view their profiles and all of that stuff. So one of the things that we realized was in Japan, and this was through like user research and on the ground kind of interviews, people don't like to put job titles, but they think of their job title more as a job function. So people won't say that they're a senior product manager, but they'll say that they're in the product management function. And even just like a small difference like that can make a huge difference with whether people are going to engage with the product or not.
User research has been key in what we do and how we do it. It's not just the user research team goes to do it, but the whole product team. So we have engineers going on the ground, and Facebook spends a lot of money just to make that happen, because we realize if we're going to build for the user, you have to understand the user. And that goes anywhere from the engineers to the designers and particularly even the marketing functions.
So interesting, right? Because from most of the points that you said, that it's very important to know the user, especially because they might have like different nuance or like different habit, like what you have, right? So aside of leveraging the data from the user, and also like of course sometimes visiting the countries as well, what are some of the tips that, or like some of the learning that you got when you are building a products?
For you don't have to be there to see trends in the data.
Yep.
So basically, when we went to Bangladesh, or even before we went to Bangladesh, there wasn't that much analysis done on how people use it for commerce. And then only when we went on the ground, we heard that people were using Facebook for commerce, and they called it F-commerce. And they're like, we have F-commerce here, not e-commerce. And we were able to see that in the data, but it was the combination of going on the ground to contextualize it. So first, maybe taking a look at the data, abnormalities, how people in specific markets are using the product. And that's literally just going through, I don't know, certain parts of the product, for example, in groups. Like, what are some of the comments? What are things that people are uploading? And then understanding on when you're going into the ground, like, why are they doing that? So when you go on the ground, it's actually to understand the why and the how, versus when you're seeing it on the platform, it's the what.
Yeah, I know you guys just entered Vietnam. I don't know if you have any insights on that.
So I think we launched in Vietnam on 1st August, so it's been very, very new. But I think it's still been like reproducing the core use case, right? So the reason why like Gojek's expanding in all these places is because they have a similar like infrastructure situation, right? Like the hyper crowded Southeast Asian city that's kind of present in all these places. And as y'all like just experienced, like it's really painful day in, day out to deal with traffic, right? So like I'm sure everyone can tell you, just being able to like zip around on a bike, like that being the first use case was really effective, right? And then from there, slowly expanding, where like Gojek started off as like just doing Ojek rides, and then they started becoming a platform, right? Like now they have Go Live, they have Go Food, and like so many other things that it was interesting because I think like I can't comment on Vietnam yet because it's been 10 days, right? So I don't have anything specific to say. But one thing that I found interesting about Gojek is that you started off with the insight that people need to get from point A to B like as fast as possible. But then that use case evolved when there were enough drivers. Then it became like this is probably overused term, like Ojek as an infrastructure, right? That's how all the other products came about. Because you have drivers essentially having a need to, okay, how do I generate more trips for a driver other than just transporting people? Like what else can they transport on a bike, right? They can transport food, they can transport documents or whatsoever. So that's where things like the courier service like GoSend and all those things came about. So those are just examples of like insights that you get after you maybe seed your primary use case, and then you see like what are all these other things that drivers may be looking out for, like in this particular case. Yeah.
I'm curious, just a question on that. What if you go to a market and you realize your core product doesn't have a fit? So for example, Gojek going to Singapore, we heard that in Singapore, the people who own cars are rich, so they're not going to be drivers anyways. So was that something you guys struggled with?
So the number one question that I get in Singapore from my friends is like, oh, like is Gojek gonna bring bikes to Singapore? So like that's like their first association, right? So first thing I have to remind them that in Singapore, bike taxis are like illegal, right? So that's not gonna happen. Secondly, in Singapore, the dynamic or the context is that the government has been trying to push for a very long time for lesser reliance on cars, independent cars, right? Which is why we have this ridiculous thing called a COE, which is like a certificate of entitlement, which can cost up to I think like 80 or 90,000 Sing dollars, right? That's apart from paying for the car. Right? So the government has been pushing for reliance on like public transport and things like ride sharing. So when Gojek goes to Singapore, the use case there is that people want more options in terms of ride sharing, which is why they're going to do Go Car, right? And maybe maybe food or something else that makes sense. But that's how they that's how they sidestep their primary use case, right? So they're not going there with bikes, but they're going there with cars first because they understand that the context there is that ride sharing is championed by the government. So they're going to have an easy time in terms of like just going to market. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what's also interesting with network-based product like LinkedIn is that a lot of times, initially, just based on the network of the people that are initially on the platform, you'll start to get users in a lot of other places. So, for example, for LinkedIn, a lot of the people in countries where LinkedIn doesn't have a focus are multinational companies, right? So if you have workers in your company in one country on LinkedIn, then people who are in other locations where maybe LinkedIn still doesn't provide language support or whatever, they still want to join the platform. So I think that's a way for a network-based product to kind of like see where is kind of the network growing. And so that helps us in some ways to prioritize that this market seems like there's a lot of opportunity here because a lot of people are signing up, even though we don't provide language support, just because the network is building up here. And so like that's one way for us to think about it. I think the other thing that Diana said, which is you can see the what in the data, but not the why. So you can see, for example, a lot of people in Brazil love to upload profile photos more than any other country. Like they have the most amount of profile photo completion.
You're the
for
most
LinkedIn.
beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, so that could be one of the whys. I don't know, but that was a really interesting insight. So there's like things that you can see about data that will tell you that people are doing certain behaviors in certain markets, but then you can jump to conclusions as to why, but then going on the ground and actually doing the research and really talking to people to understand the why, I think user research really helps there.
Right, right. So and given quite a lot of customization that you made, right, to enter Indonesia, to enter markets across the globe, I'm just curious about what type of learning did you get when your product was about to enter Indonesian market? What sort of customization or learning that you face? Because perhaps Indonesia has like some specific behaviors that's different compared to the rest of the population in the globe.
So I think again, this is where network-based social networks might be different because I don't think there was like a country by country approach as much of like, oh, we're not available in like X, for example. So it was like, because it's a network where people can invite other people, and even if localization, there was definitely an effort, which is we're going to support languages. So we're going to support like X number of languages and translate the site. But I think just because of like how like network-based products work, where it's all about I invite 10 of my friends, they invite 10 of their friends, they invite 10 of their friends, a lot of the growth just comes from that like invitations like based flow. So I would say that when I guess like a lot of the growth happened, a lot of it was that organic viral growth versus thinking about it as much like country by country. I think once a lot of that viral growth had already happened, at least at LinkedIn, the way that they approached it was, oh, we're seeing a lot of growth happen in China. We're seeing a lot of growth happen in India. We're seeing a lot of growth happen in Brazil. We're seeing a lot of growth happen in Indonesia. Can we do something specific for these markets that can even further accelerate that growth? But even without that specific thing, just because it was a network that relied on people inviting people, it kind of already was very organic.
I don't specifically work on expansion to Indonesia, so I wasn't sure what the insights are. And that's the main reason we're here to learn about that, because it's so critical to, again, be down with the people and also understand local context so that we can also bring back and say, hey, you should pay attention to this. And that's what happened last year. I went to Bangladesh for a week, and it was a life-changing trip for me. I went down to like really, really poor areas where we assumed that people were not using the internet, and we were pleasantly surprised that a ton of people there were willing to pay a significant amount of income just to use the internet because everyone's addicted nowadays. So from that trip, we learned a ton in just understanding people's internet behavior so that we can build the product to more customize towards that and hence allow them to use more internet as a reason. So I think that's critical and key, just being there on the ground in order to actually like do research, but also talk to the people who are just passerbyers.
Well, actually, one thing now that you talk about that, also like about Indonesia specifically, at least with LinkedIn, it's like a very common first launch market for us. So you guys get a lot of features before the rest of the world for LinkedIn, which is awesome. Yeah. Okay. Anyways, so yeah, it's actually like a lot of our products and new features when we like ramp them. Indonesia is one of the first markets that we test in, and I think there's a couple of reasons. One is obviously scale, so we can get access to many people that are using LinkedIn and like testing out this new feature. I think the other one is maybe even just like openness to change. And so just like if we're continuously changing the app, maybe like Indonesians are more okay with that, open to trying out like something that's like new. So that's Indonesia is definitely one of the first markets that LinkedIn often like ramps its features to. So that's it's like a way to think about it as like a test bed before we you know go to all the rest of the world and stuff.
It's interesting because then if you screw up, it's a really big consequence affecting, what is it, 400 million people?
Thanks for being forgiving.
Wow. Okay. So I think that another thing that's also important as a product manager is also to manage delivery, right? Make sure that the features are like shipped on time. And given that you are building global products, I would assume that you will require like a global team, right? Can you tell us a bit of stories about your experience working with global team? Because sometimes different time zones, different geographies, like how do you handle that? Yeah.
So for myself, because I work in the fraud team, right? So we have partners and stakeholders both in Jakarta and then as well as Bangalore, right? So I think one thing to realize is that it's difficult. Like I think we're a bit more lucky because like we're all based in Asia, right? So it's not so bad versus like being based in the US or somewhere else. The most important thing actually is to make sure that all the people that you're working with are actually aligned on the problem, first of all, right? It's funny, like this, I mean, this from personal experience. Even though you use the same term for the problem that you're trying to solve, people have slightly different conceptions about what it means and what you're solving, right? And that actually directly translates to delivery, right? Because when you're talking about the exacts of like what do we need to do, what are the things we need to track, all those things matter. So like, yeah, just aligning on the problem, and then making sure like understanding very clearly which team is going to take ownership of like which part, right? And then it becomes easy to, you kind of don't have to micromanage, right? People align towards a goal, and then you set like intermediate milestones, and then you do constant check-ins, which again from experience is easier said than done, because you can all be like, okay, let's sync up at week 3, and then in week 3 something broke 2 days ago, and now you're off cycle, you know. So all those things, you have to constantly over communicate, which is it's a challenge. But I think as a PM, like you're essentially holding like 3 ropes, and then like just trying to like hold it together and make sure everyone's on running the same race essentially. Yeah.
How many of you guys in the audience work with like a team that's in another time zone? If any of you? Okay, not a ton, but but yeah, no, I think one of the big things is the scheduling, which at least for me, like operationalizing everything is the biggest sort of like issue where to the extent where just given the time zone difference between San Francisco and Beijing or San Francisco and Bangalore, we're actually sometimes, for example, it's easier to sync up with the China team because you can talk at like certain times versus it's harder to sync up with the team in Bangalore because the time zone difference is like worse. Like you have to kind of get up in the middle of the night. So it's just based on the time zone difference, it can be likely that you'll collaborate more with one team than another team because it's just possible to set up meetings more easily with one team than another team. And that's, you know, ideally that's not how it should work. It should be the team that like, you know, makes the most sense to collaborate with. But that's such a huge part of it. I think another piece is meeting in person is like so key. So we had a project where for weeks everyone was just talking on VC and like it was really hard to get alignment. We were having the same conversations again and again and again, and it was really strange. And it was like, why can't we all be on the same page? We're talking about kind of the same thing. And a huge part of it is, especially if these are people you've never met before. So when you're working with completely new people in a completely different location, the easiest and sometimes even fastest thing can be to get on like a 15-hour flight, which sounds ridiculous, but just that one face-to-face meeting can just help so much in terms of getting clarity, getting everyone aligned, getting just really moving the project forward by a huge amount. And so I think I would say like getting into a room or just getting even like one or two face-to-face interactions is super important.
I remember that was a suggestion of my first manager. I complained to her, "Oh, this team's not doing this thing." She's like, "Get on a plane." I'm like, "But it's far, and I have a life." But yeah, I totally plus one that. And second to what you were saying, getting people to align on the problem and getting them to take ownership and getting them excited is something that is so critical to do and important in the sense then you don't have to follow up after them, because if you can get them excited, they're thinking about this when they're sleeping and they're dreaming about it. So hopefully you can get them excited enough that you don't need to constantly figure out are they doing their job, but they're coming to you with ideas in solving the problem and maybe even thinking wider than that.
Right. So I think all of you also mentioned the importance about like face-to-face interaction, right? Which I personally also believe in because a lot of my initiatives like have dependency from the folks in Bangalore. And when I fly there and like meet and it's like done. But I thought it's just me, but it's actually happening everywhere. But is there any hypothesis about like why that happens in a way, right? Because like like now it's pretty popular for people to work remotely. We have VC, we can just have a call, right? So I'm just wondering if there is like some specific reasons or hypothesis that you observe because of that.
So I'll just share my personal experience.
Yeah, sure.
It's not a groundbreaking insight. First is at some point when everyone is on Slack, some people just choose not to be on Slack. You know what I mean? Like it just becomes too much noise, and they just want to be focused on their work, right? So that's one insight. Like sometimes it's just really hard to reach people over like remote communication. And then second thing, like it's really hard to do things, especially if you work like in tech or product kind of like function, right? It's very hard to do brainstorming or like just whiteboarding things out, right? Like it's very troublesome. What am I going to like pick up like a piece of paper and be like, look at what I drew, right? And also in my specific experience, like let's say when I go to Bangalore, like a lot of the experts about some of the systems that we adopt and improve are all there. So like I don't have to schedule something. I can just walk up to them and ask that question, and then like I get unblocked right away, right? Versus the round trip of which is probably worse if you do like a US Beijing where you send out an email, you wait like 15, 16 hours, and then the response gets bounced around internally, and then you get a response, right? Like that's really frustrating. So I think that those are the reasons why like face-to-face works. Like VC is really good for like getting like I think I would say like the first 70%, where it's just like basic communication, aligning on things like sharing docs, all those things. But when you want to get specific or you have a specific blocker, it's just you go down and you're like, okay, our agenda is to bust through this part, right? Yeah, then that was the output of your trip, and then yeah, you move past it.
A key part of it we forget is when we're working with people. People have lives. And building relationships is so critical to it. And not building relationships in the sense you're building it because you want someone to do something, but just showing that you care for them. Like on Monday, I was speaking to one of our India partner engineers, and he was struggling giving me an idea in the last 2 weeks because he wasn't really doing his work. And he told me, oh, well, I was really busy the last 2 weeks because we were focusing on this thing. And after I got him excited about the problem, he was like, oh, okay, like I get it. And he was able to then take it to the next stage to say, okay, these are some solutions that we can help give you. So I think that one-on-one FaceTime and then me just talking to him about like, oh, you were busy because, you just got a kid. And how old is that kid? And diving into their personal life makes them feel like you care much more and makes them much more invested in what you're working on.
Yeah, I would kind of second in general, like just human connection. I think everyone wants to connect with people, even if that's not explicitly like a goal. But in general, it's just when someone is like, an image on like the email thread or like is an, I don't know, Slack handle or whatever, like it's very easy to just think very transactionally about them. Like, oh, our relationship is this project and these are the people involved in this project. It's just very transactional. when you meet someone in person, it's just different. Like even the VC, I think conversations after the Slack conversations after that in-person meeting can be much more productive. But having that like human connection and just actually like seeing them physically just changes your perception. It's like, oh, you're working with another person. It's versus like I don't know, an email address or like a Slack bot. I don't know. Is this a real person? They don't even have a profile picture. But, no, I think actually just like meeting in person, it just like helps you realize like this is like a real person. And actually sometimes I think about that even with ride sharing. It's kind of like they're just a person on their screen until you get into their car and they're a real person, right? And so I feel like you probably have no connection with them when they're on your screen because they're just whatever, a car. And then when you actually in the car, it's like this is a person and they have grandkids and they're whatever. They show us their pictures. Yeah, it's like it's just human connection.
And making sure that you as a PM are also open about your own life. I think when you share first, they feel much more comfortable because you kind of set the pace and set the culture of the team. So make sure you take ownership of that. I think a lot of times PM just think we're here to execute. It's not just that, but we're also the cheerleaders of our team to make sure that we celebrate the small wins so we can get to the bigger win. Otherwise, people constantly feel like this big win is so far away, it's impossible. Versus if you give them short milestones throughout the way, they always feel like, okay, like this feels good. So they want to chase after that endorphins from the small wins.
I mean, it's kind of, I'm going to make a terrible analogy here, but
Sure.
like, how many of you guys, no, I was going to say dating apps. How many of you guys are in dating apps? Like, okay, no one wants to raise their hand, but a lot of people
No
laughed
shame.
nervously. So I'm guessing like a lot of people. But yeah, like in-person meeting, the person might be totally different. Anyways, whatever. That's not the best analogy, but I think like it just like kind of highlights how like you just think of people differently if you haven't actually met them in person ever.
Yeah, completely agree in the sense that human connection is important, and there is a value of meeting the person in person so we can like interact with them directly, right? So, but in some scenarios, because of difference in background, nationalities, culture, sometimes it can be tough, right? Because when you have the intention to like care about the person like interpret differently, or in some other conflict situations, perhaps given like the context that you're facing, that I would presume that you work with people with like various nationalities. Was there any occasion when you felt that okay, this was like very challenging, but somehow you managed to go through it? Perhaps there's like a lesson that you can share on that.
Well, recently my product's been going to places in Africa, places in India, and our partners are usually very quick to say yes. Like when you're working with a Facebook, they're always like, yes, please, and what else? But sometimes we need to realize when yes actually means no. So, for example, the partner in India, they were saying yes to almost everything, but they were super slow. So, them being slow, and that is a reflection of maybe there's something else going on in their head and they're not voicing it. So, those are cultural differences where there's certain countries or certain peoples who it's very hard for them to say no to things. So instead, they'll just drag their feet. And only after I understood that from our growth manager in India did it click. And then me knowing that, I was able to work around it. For example, when they're working slow, then I'll be able to bring it up to light to say, okay, maybe they don't want to do this thing. And I'll have a separate conversation with them to say, is there other solutions you can propose that might work better for you based on what you understand in the local market? So giving them a voice to set their own solutions rather than us constantly pushing tasks at them.
Yeah, I think for me also like right before I joined Gojek, I did ask myself like being a product person is all about user first, right? And I was like, I can't even speak Bahasa that well. Like, how am I gonna really interact with the user, right? But then like when I joined the team and I spoke to everyone, you realize that people are there. Like people understand where you're coming from and they accommodate for that and they help you understand, right? And in this case, like I have a slight bias because like we're still within Southeast Asia, so we kind of like still have like a similar cultural background. So you kind of lean on that, and then you in this case you take rides and you see how people interact or how they behave, and you just learn by observation. A lot of times these things, like, no one hands you an insight necessarily. So you watch before you make assumption or presumption, and then, like, you're like, okay, this is consistent, like this is not, and this is how certain people behave in certain situations, and then you can react like accordingly, right? So I mean, that's what I've sort of done. Like, even for me, like, let's say if I'm taking a ride from the airport, right? So I use what little bahasa I know, right, to talk to the driver, and then suddenly they're much more cheerful, and they're much more happier. Where he's like, oh, do you know bahasa? And it's like, oh, sedikit, like, it works, even though they know you're a foreigner, right? Like, they can see, but that making that effort to connect with someone already makes them like very happy, right? So just things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I would add to that. I think obviously, I think curiosity and observation, I think that's pretty key. Just like making sure you're observing and learning as much as you can so you can adapt. I think the other thing that you said is if you do some research into their like either local language or something that's culturally like local to them, and kind of bring it up, or just like it's something that even if it's like a really small gesture, really shows that you put in the effort to actually research something, and like you're making an effort to fit in or adapt or learn about their culture and them. So I think that's definitely like showing that effort, I think helps. And I think like in general, my at least strategy, if all else fails, like I think humor always works. People, I think if you can always kind of just dial things down, make things a bit more humorous, I don't know, just be ridiculous, have people laugh at
things
you.
fun.
I mean, it's yeah, it just gets, I think, people just more light, just like, okay, we're all people, we're working together. It's going to be great. Yeah.
And even not talking about between different country cultures between teams. So we were talking about this today, how engineers operate differently. And no offense to the engineers, but many times it kind of feels like they just want to be told this is the exact thing to do and to go implement it. So the strategy I use is I work with my engineers and make them realize they're not just engineers, but they're also people using a product. So put yourself in the user's shoes and think, as a user, what would you do if you had to face this problem? Like, what would you do if you were faced with this specific design? How would you try to use the product? And then they build better solutions, because from that, they're able to not think of one particular solution that we're giving them, but put themselves asking, okay, what are the 5 different possible implementations and how do we turn those into technical requirements?
Yeah, I think doing the going to user research is like really helpful. So either it's like pulling in different functions into user research for like our products, or for example, like in the China team is doing user research, like can I go and join that? And then I can learn more about like what they're working on and what are the differences like in the product there and that kind of stuff. So I think putting yourself in that environment where you're essentially just like better understanding people and where they're coming from.
So immersion with the culture, like, and when with the person, like, plays a very important role to like minimize conflict and also like smoothen the collaboration, right? Okay. So before I continue asking more questions, is there any questions from the audience?
Are you guys super bored? Are you like, this is amazing?
Yes, awesome. I'll hand the mic to you.
Hello, my name is Andy. I know that the Gojek is expanding to the other country. What I would like to know is why the name itself is different in this country. They don't use Gojek anymore. I know about Goviet. Yeah. Is it a strategy? But I think it's still not a global product because the name is different. I think that's one. Okay. One.
So I am not a board member, so I'm going to try and answer that the best I can. But to my understanding, I think the reason they did that, if you look at the word Gojek, right, it came from the word ojek, which is like every Indonesian would know what it is. But if I took that word and put it somewhere else, they'll just be like, oh, like, Gojek, that Indonesian company, right? It will stop there. So the reason why they want to like kind of localize the name, I suppose, is so that people from that specific country know that, hey, okay, this is actually for us. Like in Vietnam's case, it's like Go Viet, like this is for us, right? So they start to build their own associations and like almost like loyalty to like this product because they're like, oh, this is for us. So I suspect that's the reason why they did it. But beyond that, I actually do not have more context. So that's the best I can answer.
Yeah, I also think a couple of Silicon Valley companies have different names in China. Like Airbnb has a different name. Yeah, I forgot what it's called. Something.
LinkedIn has their own brand. in
LinkedIn
China.
has a different name. Like, yeah, a bunch of companies have like different names. At least I know in like China specifically, just to feel more local. And so I think it's a pretty common strategy.
Even for consumer goods, a lot of them have different names for similar products because they realize the market, they want to identify with something they can personalize rather something that's broad.
Cool. Any other questions? Yes. Awesome. More questions. Yes. You go first.
Hi, from NUS. So I have a question for Sharu because you mentioned LinkedIn in China, but as from what I understand, many big companies in China are. I would say that China itself is very nationalistic. So many of the big companies itself are from the local people, but LinkedIn is an exception. Why do you think this is the case?
Like LinkedIn is the exception to like US companies succeeding in China or like yeah. Mhm. Yeah.
As in many of the Chinese companies that's big in China are started by the local people. As in many of the US companies try to penetrate into the China market, but they have not succeeded. Why do you think LinkedIn is an exception?
So I think there's a couple of things. There's definitely a lot more successful. If it depends on what you think LinkedIn is. So if LinkedIn is a professional social networking site, then yes, there's not that many professional social networking sites in China. There is actually a couple of networks that have been started by locals that are kind of picking up, but there isn't a professional social network that's as successful in China. But if you think of LinkedIn as a job site, then there are local sites and apps in China that are more successful than LinkedIn. If you think of LinkedIn as a content site where you get business news, then there are more local successful companies that provide business news to people in China. So I think there's certain verticals of like LinkedIn's business, like jobs, news, where there are local successful companies. I think the concept of professional social networking and why LinkedIn is the biggest right now is potentially also because it's a new concept in general. So it's not as explicit value as getting a job, getting news, buying a product, and so it's kind of a higher level like new concept. So I think that's been one advantage, which is since this is a new concept and this network already exists in all these other countries, it's something that there's an advantage. I think the other one is around what I mentioned, where a lot of the initial growth was through things like multinationals. So a lot of the users in China are actually in the companies that have these global presence. And so they have offices in like other countries. They're connected to people like outside of China as well. So I think a lot of the growth has also come from people who do a lot of cross-border business, because LinkedIn is seen as like that multinational like place to be. I think there's some things also, to be honest, that we're trying to change the perception of so that more people will adopt it. So it's not just a place for senior managers and people that lead large teams. Even if you're a student, for example, like you can still get value out of it. But the populations we succeed with right now, at least, are more of those senior people that might have these more global ties. But yeah, I think a key thing is going to be how can we appeal to a larger proportion of workers, larger proportion of people that are just entering the workforce. And so, yeah, I would say that there's still quite a while to go for that.
Yes. You ask first, yeah.
Okay, hi. My name is Tania. Just curious, is there any input to conduct an impacted or effective product? Because in my point of view, me myself from product development, I think I have so many stakeholder. Let's say, oh, the customer's pain point is our stakeholder, and then oh, the director direction is our stakeholder, or oh, the competitor's product is our stakeholder. So which one, or do you have any suggestion how to make an impacted and effective product? Thank you.
Say making sure that one of those stakeholders end up being the most important. So for example, at Facebook, we always say no matter what the directors say, the customer is always right at the end, or the user, and making sure we balance that. So for example, Facebook ads, a big part of it is actually assessed. We rank the ads based on how a user would perceive it in terms of, does it fall in line with something that they're actually interested in? If the ad doesn't, then we don't show it, even if it's going to generate us more revenue. So in that sense, we're erring on the side of user first, and then everything else will follow. So if you can draw the picture for the stakeholder that, yes, I will make sure that the user comes first, and then the revenue, long-term revenue is going to follow, they'll understand the story more.
Yeah, I would say it's similar at LinkedIn. It's called like members first, and it's just the same philosophy where even to get like a product prioritized or, you know, like green light, like, yeah, let's build this, a huge part of it is to show that like this is members first. This is something that's solving a problem for people, and this is the problem it's solving, and why is this problem like an important problem to solve? I would say that's number one. I would say there's a caveat where if there might be a difference just based on specific market conditions. So in LinkedIn's case, like the, I guess, biggest example I can think of is Germany. So Germany has a site called Xing, which is another professional social network. And LinkedIn doesn't actually have, like, because it got first to many, many markets, it doesn't have a lot of like very specific competitors that do exactly the same thing. But in Germany, there's this one competitor which is exactly the same thing. And so I think in that very specific scenario, the Germany team is very aware of this competitor and has to make some decisions based on what this competitor is doing, right? And so I think in general, the philosophy is members first, but then there are very specific conditions, like in Germany, where there is a competitor who's bigger than LinkedIn. There's a competitor that like is, you know, we have to be really aware of like what Xing is doing if we want to win in Germany. So I think that's how we think about it.
And I think a small thing I just want to add to that is that when you're working with different stakeholders, I think you need to learn what kind of language they speak, right? If you are working with someone who's more technical, and if you bore them with like charts and like, you know, revenue, they'll entertain you, but they may not be as interested as like, but you get to build this new thing, right? Like I have a new business idea and you get to build this new thing, right? Or on the flip side, like if you go to your board and you talk to them about like, architectural flows, right? They'll be like, oh, this is nice. Like what does this do for our bottom line, right? Like I'm making this really simple, but like the takeaway is that sometimes you have to make yourself a bit uncomfortable and like find out, okay, what are the terms this person uses? Like, what do they care about, right? So you could be actually working on like one thing, but like just rephrasing it in a different way will go a long way in like delivering half your message, right? And then of course after that, it's like based on all the pointers that they mentioned. Yeah.
And then generally being a PM, you have to be really good at customizing how you work towards certain people. So understanding, for example, one of my coworkers, she doesn't answer emails, but she'll answer immediately to a messenger ping. So then knowing that if I need something from her, I'll go there if it's urgent, and then everything else goes through email. So that's how you get fast execution, by understanding how people's working style is, which is a lot to remember, but
No,
that's why
actually,
you're
I
the PM.
think what you mentioned also reminded me. So we have this thing called product reviews at LinkedIn for every like major product that will be launched. There's a product review with like key stakeholders, the head of product. Sometimes our CEO joins. For a while, our CEO was also the head of product. The head of like engineering will be there. People from like business operations, legal, finance, marketing, like all the other teams. And so one of the key things is kind of just to understand like who's going to be in the room on the day of your product review, and then understanding like this is what like are the major concerns of these parties, and this is how like you would pitch to this group of people essentially. But I think at the end of the day, like it's true that you want to, customize this pitch and make sure that everyone can relate to it, but I think the problem you're solving, like the product that you're trying to build, all of that should still be like very laser focused on members and like what are the problems they have and what are you solving. But I think there's different ways to definitely message that content.
Right. It actually leads me to a question, right? Because a lot of things are involving like customizing and even like sometimes pushing back. But then again, on the other side, you need to also build relationship. You shouldn't like make enemies or piss people off. Any tips to navigate through that tough or like tricky situations?
Abstract it from people taking it personally. Sometimes people feel personally attacked if you don't think their idea is good. But if you say, okay, this was the goal and this is not what you're proposing is really aligned with the goal, then they understand that it's not something that they said wrong. It's just not following what the team had agreed on in whole. I think that's one way. Second, get them to prioritize who this actually matters to. So yes, one individual can propose a great idea, but if it's not aligned with what users want, at the end of the day, you have to tell them, put yourself in their shoes. Like, is what you're proposing something that they care about? Yeah, those are two strategies I would use.
Take them to happy hour. Yeah, like every Friday we
Get
have
them
happy hour
drunk.
at 5 p.m. at the LinkedIn office. But no, I think if you have like disagreements or things are getting really heated, like seriously, I feel like just grab a drink, go have lunch. Like, I think that definitely helps diffuse tension. I think the other one is obviously like don't take it personally. I think it's hard. It's like easy to say like, oh, I want to take it personally. Or like, in general, I think everyone tries, but it's hard because it feels like a rejection of you, even though it's not, I think it's a lot of it like how you say and like position things. So it's not like, this is not about you. This is about like
The higher purpose.
or just in general, like the problem, like focus on the problem instead of the person. So it's not like that's a terrible idea. We should do something totally different. Like, that would be a very like not great way to say something versus, as you said, like bring the attention to the problem and like kind of aligning around like this is the problem we're trying to solve. And in that way, you don't really have to even say that something was off track or say that like something was because it just would like people would just understand that like, okay, actually we should go in a different direction given that this is the framework of like the problem. So I think just like reassessing like these are the goals, this is the problem, these are the problems our users face. And then it's less about like specific people's suggestions about doing things. But yeah, in general, get a drink. I think that's the best one.
Then say no so they wouldn't be offended.
And then the PM is the ultimate diplomat. They have to figure
Or
out.
juice. I don't know if you don't drink. It's fine.
For me, I think it's slightly. I mean, it's whatever you said is still valid, but like one extra thing that I do is like usually some of these conversations are ongoing, right? So what I tend to do is like before I go in for a meeting, like I try to preempt what this person might be concerned about, or like what kind of ideas they might like, what track might they follow, right? And if you can preempt like some clashes coming up front, like just be prepared for that in the sense that if they happen to like say it, then you'll be like, okay, great, like I understand where you're coming from, but I've already thought of like something else, and like what do you think about this, right? So like it's weird, like just to borrow like a line from Inception, right? Like the way you convince people is like you let them believe like it was their idea, right? And then then you get like maximum buy it, right? Yeah. So again, this sounds like theory, but
I feel like this
it's
talk
just
has been
something-
like 80% manipulation techniques. Mind
Diplomatics
manipulation.
is
That's what it's all about. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks for sharing. Any questions? Awesome. More questions. Who? Okay, you go first.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Rizky. I would like to ask all three of you, like, how do you guys fit in a very big company like LinkedIn or Facebook? Because I mean, you guys have been doing everything's like basically right, like it fit more. And is there any projects that been like release some feature for certain markets, right? And suddenly it fails, or you guys suddenly okay, maybe this won't work for this kind of market. Maybe you should try another market or something like that. So can you please share about it? Thanks.
One product, not that it's failed, but it's much harder in different markets, is mobile payments. But within Facebook, we have Messenger Pay in the US, and it's only available for some markets. So it's almost one of those things we don't want to launch in other markets because we're afraid it will fail, even from regulation perspective. So that's one thing. On your first question, innovation is such a word that people obsess over, but people don't really know what it is. But I would always say start from the user. Like, what is a people problem that you're trying to solve, and then work back from that. So sometimes the innovation might be in the technology, not really the business model. For example, one way we develop products, what the reason marketplace came to be at Facebook was because we were observing people were buying and selling on Facebook. There are a ton of people creating these buying selling groups, people trying to find apartments with each other, and all of this interaction of Facebook users using it a certain way. And we're just like, we might as well build a product to accommodate that and to make it even easier. So in that sense, it wasn't really an innovation, but it is an enabler for how a ton of people are using Facebook anyways. And I would say that's innovative in the then specific features that we enabled to allow people to do that easier and to do it better than some of the other platforms.
Yeah, so I would say that LinkedIn kind of, it is a big company in the sense there's like 10,000, 11,000 people, but the R&D team, product engineering, is still actually pretty small. So in that sense, it still feels pretty small. The other piece around failure, like, yeah, there's definitely been like tons of failed products and features. And I think LinkedIn tried to do events a while back and it didn't really work out. There was like, at one point we were also trying to do like, maybe users want a separate app for managing their network. Maybe they want a separate app for job search. Maybe they want a separate app for like another function. And that wasn't a great idea. Actually, people just want one LinkedIn app with everything in it. And yeah, there's just like a lot of things where, you know, we tried stuff like even I think several years ago, like trying to enter Japan and like didn't really work that well. So I think few things is, yeah, it can be very demoralizing to be in a team where it failed and like you're not going to do that anymore. I think realizing kind of the one biggest piece that LinkedIn tries to do is what are we learning from this? Like a postmortem to just understand why something happened. And failure isn't like, it's not like a bad thing. It's kind of just we tried to do something. And yes, there's a postmortem around like understanding why something failed, but being kind of entrepreneurial in that way and like having tried that to solve that problem and go after it in the first place is also celebrated. So generally, there's this really big sense of like this is more of a learning. It's not really like a failure because we're gonna continue to fail like in general. Like we're gonna be attempting new things and some things will work, something won't work, but not really penalizing people from trying new things and getting stuff out there. So I think that's one big piece, and then also just making sure that the team is still feeling very motivated. They're getting to work on like other products that are shipping. I think that's really important as well. So I think those are a few things that they really try to do in general, just to make sure that everyone is still feeling like very passionate and motivated about the problem.
So I have a slightly tangential like response to that. So in one of my previous companies, I was working in the growth team, right? And one thing that they do to try and defend against like failures is to run cheap experiments, right? So that when it fails early, you learn something from it, and then you kind of course correct. So we were trying to build like a search feature, so that people could discover the features of the app that they were building better, right? And we did this whole fancy thing where we built like things very similar to Google search. Essentially, we search for any like feature, like it will pop up, and then you can discover better. The insight we got from that was that actually people just prefer reading a static website, right? So that was very interesting because like just because
like a menu instead of a search box.
It's just like a typical like 2 by
okay.
X size just features, right? So there was actually no difference in terms of user engagement on like having a search versus this. So that was an interesting insight because like just because it works for something like search or like Google search, even though you're trying to frame this as a search problem, we realized that the biggest issue there was that people don't know what to search for, right? So you can't sometimes if you want to if you want to reframe like some of these product ideas that you come across, that's where you run an experiment, right? So if we had like launched this full-fledged being like, oh, we have cool search, now you can look for everything that we can do, it actually wouldn't have made a difference, right? So that was like one anecdote.
Yeah, I think
that
kind of
had.
like similar to that is in general, like trying to understand what might be like a super user feature versus like maybe only less than 1% of people would need it or use it versus what are the features that would broadly apply to like 90% of the population.
Yeah, that's true. It's very easy to try to build everything, and you have those products that have so many features to the point where a new user comes in and they're like, "Where do I go? Where do I start?" We had an early experience this morning, but so yeah, being wary of that.
Okay, cool. So the final question that we wanna ask you is that this right. I think that product management is something that's pretty new, right? It's a pretty new practice in Indonesia, and as far as I know, there is no like formal education degree for this. So if someone wanna hone like a skill as a product manager, be it like a very junior product, be it someone who is not on product management but wants to be a PM, or a junior PM wants to be like a more senior PM, what would be your advice for people who want to upgrade their skill as a product manager?
Well, is that the case? People in the audience, are most of you want to be product managers? Are you existing product managers? Okay.
Who are existing product managers? And who aspire to be a product manager?
Yeah, so we have
Okay.
the mentors and mentees.
I guess
You
are
guys
sitting
help
right
each other
next
out.
to each other.
That's the skill set. But what are skill sets for? Okay.
So I think one that our VP product mentioned was he thinks of like I remember my first day at LinkedIn. He kind of like talks to like every new person who joins the product team, and like the first day LinkedIn's like now gotten better at having a real orientation. But like back then, it was just he would just sit down with you and be like, "This is what product is," and whatever. And so he had this like triangle with like concentric circles or something. I don't know. It just looked really cool. And it's like okay, there's design, which is like one aspect. There's like general management, which is another aspect, and then there's like data science. That's like a third aspect. And so, in general, like finding you're not going to be very rarely are people amazing at like all three. And so, are you more of a like design oriented PM? Are you really passionate about the user? Are you really passionate about usability and that kind of stuff? Are you more of a data and kind of growth oriented PM? Where you're kind of just like more focused on like the data science aspect and like just really want to dig deep into the numbers and understand like the data behind the product. And then the general manager one is more around, are you like more business oriented? Are you more around like thinking of business models, different ways to, think of your broader business and not just like the product. And so that was one kind of, I thought, like insightful way to think about it, which is there's three big kind of areas of the job. You have like the design aspect, the data science, and like the general management, and like where you fall in that spectrum. So that's, I think, one thing. I think the other piece is like if you're especially someone who's thinking about getting into product management, like for a lot of people is like, I think one of the best things you can do is to really understand what it means. And so like talking to PMs at like different companies, a lot of times product management differs from company to company. So what one company calls product management is different from what another company might call product management. And so just talking to a lot of different product managers at different companies to just understand what the role is at each of those companies could be a really good way to also understand that. I think the other thing that I found, especially for people who are in college, or even if you're not in college, like in general, just going out and like building stuff, just having the experience of like whether it's going to a hackathon and like building something there, or trying to build something in your personal time, free time, just the experience of going through building a product, I think really helps you with thinking through kind of just like the life cycle of what product managers think through at these companies. Like, how do you think about what is the problem you want to solve? How do you think about like what's the way you're going to solve the problem? How do you test this? What is different ways for you to build like an MVP? Like a lot of these things. So just like think about a problem that you've been trying to solve in your life and like can you build something around that? I think that's a great way to also just get a taste of like what it's like because you'll be doing so many different things and going through the whole life cycle of what it's like to build a product.
Work backwards from existing products you see. So look at the Gojek app and look at each specific element. why do you think they built that? What pieces went into it in terms of the technical and marketing? And constantly having that curiosity will help you think like a product manager. So when you go to the interview, you'll at least be prepared when they ask you the questions.
Yeah, I would say around just like in general, like analyzing products or just trying to have a point of view around like, oh, I think this app works because of this. Like, I think this is successful because they did X, Y, and Z. So just like building, just
The aliens coming.
Yeah, I know.
Bring us back.
They want to be product managers too. Yeah, it's like, you know, the new sexy thing. Or even interplanetary species want in. Yeah. But in general, I would say just like maybe being critical and thinking about like these are products that I think are well designed. These are products that I think are not well designed, and like why. You know, when you're just going about your day to day, just like starting to just have that more analytical mindset around like what are products that work really well, what are products that don't work well, and why.
So I think, like you mentioned, like I think there's a lot of assumption about what product management is, and I feel like the biggest misnomer is the word manager in the title.
Managing Google Docs.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's actually that's what we do. No, I'm kidding.
And calendar invite.
Yeah.
Hey,
Yeah.
don't denounce us.
No, these are great things.
Yeah. It is really like product manager, right? And then you're working with people, right? People have, even when you join a team, they'll be like, oh, it's the PM, it's the PM. You know, they make all the decisions. It's not like that, right? Like your goal is to make sure that everyone's work ties in together so that you achieve a goal that makes sense for your business, right? Imagine your team worked for 3 months, everyone works really hard, and then it amounted to nothing. Like everyone's gonna feel dejected, right? So I think that's where your role sits. And then for me, this is just from my own personal experience, which is maybe slightly counterintuitive. So yes, go to hackathons, do things, build things, but also be very purposeful about what you're building, right, or why you're doing it. I have been to a lot of hackathons where you hear a lot of like recycled ideas, right? Like I like no comment on that, but like then go to a hackathon knowing that, hey, I'm going there to learn how to MVP something really fast or build something really fast. If you want to be a product person, it's actually a really slow and enduring process, right? You don't come up with insights in 1 hour or 2 hours unless you have everything at your disposal, right? A lot of things come from day-to-day observation. For example, like, the way I make payment on this particular app really sucks. Like, I would do it better like this, right? So it's really a mindset that you have to like train and cultivate. Like, and for me, like even though like I'm X months into the job, that's still something that I'm learning, right? So it's really a muscle that you kind of have to train. I'm not saying like don't do all these other things, right? Like, and then also the last thing I would say is like, your job is to be slightly imaginative, but also be very, very aware of like what is possible, right? Because you have to connect the two. Like at the end of the day, you can promise people a lot of things, but if you don't know how to translate that into like delivery or actionable items, then that's going to be a mismatch. So that's why I would say like be aware of like, let's say if you're working as like in a tech company, be aware of like how technical systems work in general, like how do things talk to each other, design principles, like how do I even start? And then all these things are like really easy, like with the internet now. For example, how do you build a landing page? How do you build onboarding? How do you build these things, right? These are like little recipes that you can go around and just pick up, and it's something that's cumulative, right? Like this is something just slightly more specific, because I know like a lot of people always be like, okay, yeah, I know there's 3 areas, but how do I get more specific? Yeah, so I think the biggest takeaway is like really train yourself to be very nuanced and thoughtful about like why things are designed this way. And last thing I want to add is there's immense bias of like product management or development towards tech products, right? If I ask you today, why was this table built this way? You will find yourself asking way more questions. Or like, why was this chair built this way, right? So there's a lot of like...
why? What is that thing in the middle? Like, I don't get it.
Yeah, so in this case, it's to like carry the table easier, right? Because if not, I have to kind of like go from underneath, right? It's a very weird design, right?
Even I don't know the answer.
Optimized for people that are gonna carry it around.
So I'm making a guess, right?
But is that the main use of a table?
Exactly.
It?
So you see, even between both of us, we have like 3 or 4 questions, right? And the point is to like just go to products in general. It doesn't have to be tech products, right? Like, okay, why was my CRT TV designed with a knob and not a switch, right? You know, like really mundane things like that. And then or like odd things like look at your iron, right? When you iron your clothes, right? Why does it have a dial for the steam function, right? Whereas some have a button to like press and steam, right? So like the more you actually move away from tech, you actually exercise your muscles stronger. Because what has happened in like the last few years is with all the apps kind of like reusing like best practices, everyone's kind of familiar or has come to expect certain flows, right? But where you really get fuzzy is when you move away from things that are familiar. Then you'll be like, okay, actually, I don't really know why this is built this way. Maybe I should go like think about it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a really good book called The Design of Everyday Things, which is like kind of what he's describing. Yeah, Don Norman's like essentially like just a really good book to read about just thinking about how to analyze like what is good design. And it's not in the context of just technology, just like any object that you see in the universe, like, is this well designed?
Critically thinking about that, sometimes when you're asking yourself, why is it designed that way? The answer could be like, that's a stupid way to design it.
Yeah.
That's what he says in the book, that most of design in the world is actually really terrible. So being able to differentiate between bad and good design is also a critical skill that PMs have. I was going to say PMing is a catch-all for everything. So when you want to become a strong PM, it's kind of like you need to learn a little bit about marketing, a little bit about technical systems and architectures. So being able to grasp that will also build you to become a stronger PM as well.
Cool. Thanks for sharing. So it's a wrap of our discussion today. So please give a round of applause for our PMs, for Diana, Charu, and also Amit. Before we go, Nick, after this we can just have like a networking session when mentors can connect with mentees, or you guys can approach our speakers because they will still be here for quite some time. But before we go for the networking session, perhaps we can take like a group picture together. Yeah. Yes.
Maybe we should go there.
Yeah.
No, I think we should go there.
Yeah.
Up to you. How is the best way to do it?
Oh, actually, he's over there. Like,
Yeah. Okay.
But we're going to mobilize so many people. That's inefficient.
Stop trying to product manage this.
Okay, thank you. That's also marking our end of the session. So thank you so much for coming to Gojek. And please, if you're curious about our next Go Talk session, you just can click at our LinkedIn. We share a lot of information there. And if you want to join Gojek, you just can find others, people who use tech.